Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I wish to extend a warm welcome to all participants. My name is Sarah Grant-Clement, and I'm a researcher in the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program and the Security and Technology Program at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, and I have the pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. Uncrewed systems, which include uncrewed aerial, ground, and maritime systems, are increasingly being developed and used by a wide range of state and non-state actors in the military realm. The increased development and use of uncrewed systems has been enabled by lower cost of production and a range of technological advances, which have made these systems easier to use over longer periods of time and with additional and more advanced capabilities. As such, the attractiveness and use of such systems has grown considerably over recent years. Moreover, the combination of these elements also introduces important questions about proliferation and misuse, as well as regulatory measures and countermeasures. And it is with this context in mind that UNIDIR and the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, UNODA, are co-organizing a series of 3 webinars generously funded by Portugal. The overarching objective of this webinar series is to stimulate discussion between a range of stakeholders on key topics relating to uncrewed systems and to identify areas of continued challenges, including gaps in knowledge and policy, as well as possible avenues for action. We are joined today by a range of representatives from member states, UN entities, civil society, and the private sector, and we are pleased to welcome you all to the 3rd and final webinar in our 3-part series, which will focus on addressing the threat of uncrewed systems, what actions for the multi-stakeholder community. Our 2 previous webinars in this series have explored, in turn, issues of terminology and classification and benefits and risks of uncrewed systems, with a particular focus on uncrewed aerial systems. The diversity in users and uses of UASs has made for a very information-dense second webinar. Our excellent speakers spoke on the one hand of the benefits that UASs can bring to aid assistance, compliance with IHL obligations, and improvement of precision of military action. On the other hand, they also noted an important number of risks. These included, but are not limited to, the use of these systems outside of situations of conflict, which undermines international legal principles, and the fact that these systems can further empower violent non-state armed groups. These discussions also highlighted a number of challenges to broader peace and security that the proliferation and use of these systems could bring, such as a minimization of risk and thus an increased use of lethal force, lack of accountability by users, and increased lethality of operations aided by such uncrewed systems. While only a short snapshot of many important points raised in that webinar, these issues demonstrate how transparency, arms control, counter-proliferation measures, and broader policy, legal, and operational frameworks governing the use of uncrewed systems are critical aspects to ensuring that these systems are used by legitimate users and for legitimate purposes. In today's webinar, we will therefore examine what frameworks and mechanisms are currently in place to regulate the development, transfer, and use of UASs, what gaps currently exist, and what could be done to overcome these gaps, including whether international norms and standards should be improved or updated. Before I turn to our distinguished speakers, a few housekeeping and administrative remarks. Participants are joining as attendees and thus will have their cameras and mics off by design to accommodate the large number of participants. Participants are also strongly encouraged to post their questions using the Q&A function at any time during the event. As time permits, I will relay these questions to the floor or the specific panelist should you indicate one. And if possible, please also indicate your name and affiliation. Should any questions go unanswered because of time constraints, UNIDIR will follow up with panelists and provide you with a response bilaterally after the event. Please also note that this event is recorded and will be made available on UNIDIR's and ODA's website following the event. And with that, I'm happy to close that section of the announcements, and I'm pleased to welcome our 3 fantastic speakers for today's discussion. So we are joined by Jessica Dorsey, who is an assistant professor of international and European law at Utrecht University, and who is also a member of the Global Commission on Responsible Artificial Intelligence in the Military Domain. We also have amongst us Chantal Lavallée, who is an associate professor in international studies and director of the Center for Security and Crisis Governance at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean, as well as senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Rachel Stoll, who is Senior Vice President of Research Programs and Director of the Conventional Defense Program at the Stimson Center. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you for joining us. And to start off with, I just want to kick us off with maybe just a framing question. And for that, I'd like to turn to you, Rachel, to start us off. Could you explain to myself and the audience what frameworks currently exist to govern and regulate uncrewed aerial systems and their components? And to your mind, what are the gaps of these existing mechanisms? Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and UNIDIR and UNODA and the government of Portugal for this important discussion. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on an all-women panel talking about this issue. So very, very pleased to be here. I think I'm going to step back for just a second, Sarah, and say, why do we care about international standards or international framework to regulate or to govern UAV or uncrewed systems use and export? And I think it's because we've seen in the last 20 years or so the increase in attention on these systems in terms of their use, in terms of their development, in terms of their proliferation. And they have changed in some ways the face of many conflicts around the world. And we have different sizes and capabilities. And you mentioned in your introduction, we have air, land, sea. There's a lot of complex aspects to this technology that are improving operational capabilities for governments and non-state groups alike. And I think we've seen innovations in the use of lethal force within and outside traditional battlefields that have really sort of encouraged governments and other stakeholders to look with more concern at these issues, and not just in terms of their use, but also their proliferation, which goes back to their export. Obviously, there are issues of diversion that we can talk about as well, but for the most part, what we're looking at is national exports and use. We definitely have heard the call that improved transfer control mechanisms are needed to better regulate the unique risks that are posed by the proliferation of these systems and ensure that states have updated their risk assessment procedures to not only prevent diversion, but to consider the international legal frameworks guiding use of force as well. So we have a large body of existing mechanisms and existing regulations around export, as well as those around use. And there's this idea of sort of responsible use of technology. So I think the question that I'm about to answer is really looking at what is that balance? How do we regulate technology proliferation? How do we develop new technologies? How do we develop norms for responsible use? And how can we find domestic and international controls in a position to best protect national security interests, the waging of conflict, but also, of course, human security concerns? And I think what we've seen in the past is that when we've tried to do this, we have very siloed approaches. So you have frameworks that guide international transfers of conventional weapons, including uncrewed systems, and we have a set of laws and regulations around the law of armed conflict, so international human rights and international humanitarian law. In the past few years, we've seen an effort to try and link these two, and so I'm going to talk about that in a second, but in many ways. But I think we're also seeing the conversation change a little bit, particularly, I would say, in the last 5 years, where now we're not looking at the technology as much, we're looking at responsible use of force. So lethal force is a term you'll hear a lot, rather than focusing solely on the technology itself. And I think that, to answer your question last, which was what are the gaps? I think that's a gap, right? Like whenever you create regulations about a particular technology, the technology is changing so quickly that you sort of outpace yourself in terms of you're always behind trying to regulate something new. And so there's an effort, I think, in the past 5 years or so to really look at these larger concepts of law of armed conflict, use of lethal force, and not as much on the use of that particular technology because it gets, will change the parameters of the distance or the payload, and suddenly it's outside what you had controlled. There are several international mechanisms in place that relate to the export of UAVs or uncrewed systems and related technologies. They, I think, vary widely in terms of their scope, in their participation rates, in some would say their degree of relevance. And I think that current international standards really only make a very tenuous link between export and use. So that in and of itself is a gap. But we can talk about that. So there's an opportunity to create something new that would make those links stronger and that would perhaps close some of the loopholes. I'm going to name a few of these international regimes. There are undoubtedly more. There are also national regulations that exist in many cases, which are stronger and more comprehensive than what exists at sort of the multilateral level. But I don't have time to go into each national regulation. So I'm gonna name a few that sort of have been thrown around, particularly in the UN context, as being instruments that perhaps could shed some light on ways that we could strengthen international regulation. So the first is the Missile Technology Control Regime, which you all know is a voluntary partnership between 35 countries that's looking to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and the means by which WMDs are delivered. And that's where sort of uncrewed systems come in because they fall within that delivery system definition. There's different categories that are covered within the MTCR. Category 2 covers platforms with a range of at least 300 kilometers, while Category 1 covers vehicles that are capable of carrying 500 kilogram payloads over 300 kilometers. And again, that's important because then you can make them for 299 kilometers and 500, right, like 499 kilograms. So those like concrete definitional parameters sometimes create problems. There's also UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which prohibits states from aiding non-state actors in acquiring WMDs or any technology that may be used to deliver such weapons. And again, this is where sort of uncrewed systems fit in. The resolution was adapted in 2013 to include the use of UAVs or UASs as delivery vehicles. And states now have a mandatory duty to report unmanned systems in their obligations to meet the requirements of Resolution 1540. Again, it's very narrow definition. It's only applying to those that are capable of delivering WMD systems, but there's something at least as an example that we can draw from. We also have, of course, the Arms Trade Treaty that is a legally binding agreement that regulates the global trade in conventional weapons. It's got a very large scope. It has categories. It doesn't have definitions, so it's up to states to identify whether or not they include uncrewed systems in the scope of the treaty for them. I think there is no explicit listing of uncrewed systems, but I think it's quite implicit that they are covered, and some states do report on their, and we'll talk about transparency later, but report on their exports of uncrewed systems as well. What's interesting about the ATT is it does have that link between export and use. So it's pretty explicit, don't transfer if these prohibitions or these circumstances are in place, or here's the risk assessment that you undertake if you are going to transfer those systems. And part of that is very much a human rights, a civilian protection sort of lens. And then, of course, there's the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is an agreement between 42 states that stipulates export controls for conventional weapons, dual-use goods, and related technologies. And here's another area where you have a control list. That control list can contain unmanned aerial vehicles, specially designed, modified, or equipped for military use, including, and then it has a list of things that those systems include. So also has a and there are rules around exports between Bossanar arrangement countries and between non-Bossanar arrangement countries, and on reporting of exports of the items on that list. So I think those are, some examples of how that's been sort of undertaken in some international instruments. You may remember that the United States also initiated an effort to create international standards called the Joint Declaration for the Export and Subsequent Use of Armed or Strike-Enabled UAVs. Originally, 53 members had signed on to that. It really called on states to develop something more, to develop global standards on export and subsequent use. There has been a core group of states that for many years has been looking at this more closely. I think the process has stalled a little bit, but I would say it's been undertaken without a lot of transparency and without the involvement of key industry or civil society or international organizations. So I can't give you a lot of information, but at least that was something that a few years ago was quite popular. And now, of course, and we have Portugal with us today, we're seeing action by Portugal to consider a UNGA resolution to address uncrewed systems. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway of that resolution will be holding a multilateral exchange of views. So where are we at more than sort of, I'd say 15 years after starting this conversation or renewing this conversation? Where are we at? What are the key issues? How has conflict changed? I really want to commend this initiative because we're, I think, way overdue to revamp the conversation in the international system. I think that the biggest gaps that I've seen and sort of what I would encourage that conversation to look at is not to be so focused on the individual systems or the individual specifications of those systems. We all know that there's new innovations that are being created regularly to make these lighter and faster and have different capabilities, but we know sort of what the core piece that we're concerned with addressing. And so we should focus on ways to sort of in a holistic way, look at these systems and try to develop some sort of standards that are replicable, that are sustainable, and that are applicable across a wide variety of situations and for a wide variety of countries. So not have it so narrowly focused that it's really irrelevant to the majority of stakeholders. Maybe I'll stop there, and hopefully that's at least been some food for thought on sort of what exists and where we need to be going.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Indeed, you stole the words right out of my mouth. I was about to say that gave us a lot to consider and to also unpack as we continue with the questions and the kind of investigation of what is out there and what could be done. And I particularly like kind of that historical view as well, kind of where we were, where we are now. And indeed, the issue of classification and so on is something that was touched upon in the first webinar. So it's very interesting to see how it's being touched upon here again, kind of the technology and the classification and the tensions that exist there. And maybe to unpack kind of the different elements of your answer, we can first look into kind of the production, acquisition, and transfer of such systems, and then we can come to the use and proliferation. So with that in mind, I now want to turn to you, Chantal, and ask you, we talked about the technology aspect and kind of the use of new and emerging technologies increasingly being embedded in these systems. How do we govern the production, acquisition, and transfer of such systems when technology is such an integral part of it? So not only in the UAS as a whole, but also in their various parts and components.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And again, many thanks to Nidir and Odier for this really nice invitation. I'm really happy to be part of the discussion today. So is a really, of course, a big question, which I think requests Maybe some introductory remarks just to also set the scene. But first, as Rachel explained, I think first of all is all about respecting and implementing also the current frameworks. So Rachel pass over the different initiative framework, and I think we should also have in mind that some of the major producer of armed drones are not member of the current crucial regime, or some have signed but not ratified, or some are still non-signatory parties. And I think this is a starting point to ask why. And I think the easy answer is, of course, we are exactly in the national prerogative. If we speak about defense-related equipments, emerging technologies, I think is, of course, especially from an industrial perspective, it's vital tools for investment, for research development. So many states will argue that it's part of their industrial and research development, which also brings some pressure from the industry. So I think it's, as Rachel highlighted already, is complex. There's many facets to consider. And also, maybe just as a quick point, I did research quite a lot on the regulation for civil drones in Europe. And even for civil drones, as is such a booming sector, is emerging technology with so many new applications, it was a long process as well. It was not that easy. And we were speaking about something really different. So we should also consider that this sector raised a lot of social, political, economic considerations. I look my notes, I prepare many points, and 5 minutes I try to cover. I hope I will be clear. And if not for the question period, I would be happy to come back on some points. But we should consider that it's raising many concerns. And again, working a lot on the European Union, I speak about the civil drones, but if we look also about the arm export, the drones export policies, it's not that easy neither, even inside among the 27 countries, because we touch the national interest. So there's a will of cooperation, but at the end of the day, it's also the prerogative of the states to decide. And I think we should have also this in mind. So asking how we can govern production, acquisition, and transfer of new emerging technologies, I think we should have in mind we touch, and it's not new, I think all our participants are fully aware of this issue, and they are themselves trying to find a way out with all this joint declaration, which is already a great step. What I wanted to highlight also, we should not forget that is, of course, the dual-use technology is again highly competitive, especially in the context of unfortunate arms race, and is of course lucrative field. So if we speak about drones market, is with the growing demand. So I think there's many aspects to consider, and which might explain the risk of bypassing all this control regime in place. And before to go with the concrete answer, because I did prepare more specific answer, but just in this general introductory remark, I want to highlight we should not underestimate with the war in Ukraine, what we have learned already in the last year about drones being central part of the war. Many observers speaking about game changer on the battlefield, and this changed quite a lot. If we speak about production, we all know that Ukraine decided to develop its own national production, speaking about producing at least 1 million of drones for this year. And but it's more complex than this. We have seen many civilians using hobbyist drones, weaponizing the civil drone, commercial drones, to use them on the battlefield. So we enter a kind of gray zone. If we consider this new reality, then we speak about controlling the productions and acquisition transfer. It's raised also many questions there. This is on the production for the Ukraine case, but if we speak about acquisition, we know all about this donation. So all the civilians managed to create a fundraising platform to be able to buy drones and find different ways to access drones, which raise also other concern. What I want to highlight and to bring in the discussion is an interesting initiative also, this drone coalition, which which is led by the UK, but was initiated by Ukraine and also now a series of many countries who want to support, of course, Ukraine, and I want to highlight this initiative for several reasons, because they have created an MOU framework to be able to create a common fund, enable joint procurement, and also planning to deliver 1 million of FPV drones to Ukraine and other type. And this brings me to more concrete answer. Maybe this could be something to think about if countries and being afraid that the war might, for the European countries, also have the direct impact on their own national security, are able to create this kind of coalitions to provide drones to create joint procurement. Of course, it's just a list of a few states, but it might create a kind of interesting example to follow and see that maybe it's possible when the situation gets critical that countries are able to coordinate and think even about joint procurements to provide, of course, here one country, but I think it's something to have in mind. For concrete answers, I think Rachel highlighted there are many joint declarations, so many initiatives in the last years. I think it's maybe time to operational these declarations because they are really nice to read at, but maybe we can think about really more concrete norms or to clarify beyond good principle and wishes, which is of course the necessary first step, but maybe it's the time to think about how we interpret this principle, maybe thinking, and it's just not just me saying this, I think there's a growing literature speaking about sharing an interpretation, a better to harmonize understanding and practices on the regulation, on the principles, on what need to be done, and not just that each state will take what is good for them or give a sense, but I think it's maybe a time to develop this common understanding. And of course, as all this joint declaration speak in favor of strengthening the international cooperation, but at all level, also at the regional level, and exchanging the good practices, but create this movement who might, but again, we should not be too naive. We touch really, as I said, highly competitive, lucrative domain. So we need to change maybe traditional behavior of states, but it's not impossible. Again, the war in Ukraine have shown that many countries have started to revise their export policy in a way to be more balanced, and the way to say, oh, in some case, it could be allowed to support in the case of Ukraine because its self-defense is a UN charter, so Ukraine is in its right to defend itself, so we can support and sell and provide drones. So I think we are in a situation that this current example obliges us to think outside the box, not to say a cliche, but indeed, and to finish, because I'm aware I was speaking quite long, but as Rachel mentioned, ATT is indeed legally binding, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the first, but it's still missing some strength and lack of sanction or control on the compliance. And this is in my point of view, the real issue. If states really want to go forwards in the direction of controlling the production, the acquisition, and the transfer, especially, they should reconsider, reevaluate international framework which are more legally binding, not just on a voluntary basis, because then they open the door of all these non-signatories states, or those who are signing but never ratifying, or even not really complying for maybe national security reason. But this can become a big issue at the end of the day if on sanction and non-compliance is a possibility. At the end of the day, we will never get out of the current situation. So I will stop here. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Chantal. Yeah, your answer is very interesting, bringing in that multi-stakeholder element and indeed highlighting both national production and acquisition, two aspects to be very cognizant about. And I think also something that you know alluded to, and Rachel also touched upon in her first answer, was transparency and the need for transparency. And maybe Rachel, coming back to you, what do you see as being the issues that emerge from the lack of transparency regarding production, acquisition, and transfer of UASs? And how do you think transparency could be improved?
Yeah, I mean, you'll notice I said very little about transparency. I made one sort of reference, and I think that's because there are not a lot of ways in which we can uncover information at this point about national procurement or transfers, both on the importing side or the exporting side. And I think we have to look at, you know, why is this important? Why do we need to know this, right? To encourage states to do more and to do better. I mean, there's a lot of gaps. Chantal mentioned, you know, only the ATT is really is mandatory and has a mandatory reporting obligation on these items, but it's not a universal instrument, and we don't have universal reporting. So we don't have sort of an international picture. We do have some reports from national entities, but those are going to vary from country to country. They're hard to compare data from country to country to give us a good picture. Some report on exports, some only report on imports, some report on deliveries, others on authorized transfers, some on national procurement, but there's no standard sort of national report template. And they're even at the regional level, you know, when you try to pull information together, I think it's really difficult. We do have the UN Register of Conventional Arms as well. Again, a voluntary instrument, but it should be, you know, we should encourage more states to use it, as it is part of the UN system. So there's many more member states that belong to that than to other international instruments. Only recently has it been as explicit about uncrewed systems. You can include national procurement on a voluntary basis. But again, it's politically binding, and so you don't see that universal participation. The ATT, as I said, it's mandatory reporting, but it's we don't have a lot of information at this point on uncrewed systems, and states choose what they're going to report. I think that if we have more transparency, it will ensure that states are more I would like to say more responsible, or at least more aware that their exports and transfers are being examined more thoughtfully, and so there could be more accountability. We've seen transparency around arms transfer decisions writ large be very siloed amongst a very narrow set of stakeholders, even though when you make those transfer decisions, it has impact across a very large group of stakeholders. But if you have greater public transparency, it will ensure that these transfer decisions are made within a framework that does not sacrifice human rights or civilian protection. And you have to sort of explain the choices that you make. It gives you that sort of accountability aspect as well. And those who choose to make transfers that are questionable, or that potentially lead to conflicts or support conflicts, those leaders, those governments will have to defend their decisions publicly and bear sort of the consequences of what that sort of public decision making and accountability aspects lead to. It's also helpful for us as researchers. I know we're not sort of the primary audience here, but to be able to have a conversation like this, to be able to provide thoughtful analysis and recommendations, we need to have that access to information to study the impact of the transfers that are occurring, the potential risk assessments that should be undertaken, mitigating measures that could be implemented, and identifying solutions to sort of address some of the challenges that we've seen with the rise of uncrewed systems in the past 20 years or so. Without that information, we're sort of talking only sort of in not half truths, but only halfway. We can't sort of look at the full picture. So I think the gaps in transparency are quite large. It doesn't stop us from providing recommendations, but I think it's something that's very tangible that can be improved, right? You can have very clear requirements or requests or templates for information so that we can be comparable from case to case, from state to state, and in circumstance to circumstance.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This was really interesting. And Jessica, I feel like I've been ignoring you, so apologies, but I now want to turn to you. We've heard a lot about kind of the, acquisition, production, transfer aspects, but obviously use and proliferation is also a very important aspect. So I want to ask you, how does the use of UASs in situations of conflict differ from the use of other conventional weapons, both currently and taking into account future capabilities? If you could give us kind of some scene-setting remarks with regards to that.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to UNIDIR, to you and ODA, as well as to Portugal for this. And again, I echo Rachel's comments on being featured in a womanal, so that's the opposite of a manal. Happy to be here. And these opportunities and challenges we're talking about, I'll link some of my comments, I think, to things that Rachel and Chantal have already highlighted. They're not new, but they're not going away. And the systems, as they proliferate and we see more integration of newer technologies, AI-enabled systems, the problems that we're highlighting are exacerbated. So following from previous webinars, just to position myself, I understand definitional clarity and conceptual clarity is very important. Most of my work over the past 15 years or so, time flies, has centered really on the legal frameworks. I'm an international lawyer with a focus on IHL, international humanitarian law, as well as human rights law. I've been very keen to understand these particular systems insofar as they relate to how lethal force is deployed, and specifically, particularly, the place of protection of civilians within that discourse. And I think that that's how my sort of research and career trajectory has gone from the use of armed drones into this space regarding newer technologies, the integration of AI-enabled systems. But again, the problems are very similar. But back to your question, in a legal space, I often am challenged with, well, how are these vehicles, airplanes, any different from conventional platforms? They're not, from a legal perspective, anything other than regulating an F-35 or an F-16 or other kinds of platforms. And I agree at a very basic level that's the case. We have robust legal frameworks that address the way that these can be used, means and methods of warfare outlined in the Geneva Conventions and customary international humanitarian law. I don't need to go through the entire role of it, but I do think, and I'm not at all a proponent of any kind of new treaty. I don't think there's appetite for that. There's no need for a drones treaty, but what there is a need for, and this echoes Rachel's points about the silos in which we usually operate. We need to bring the silos, we need to link them. I talk about different lenses. The lens of protection of civilians is a lens. Legal frameworks is a lens, military AI is a lens, drone technology is a lens, but we need to be looking through all of those together and at the same time in order to understand in a comprehensive way how to do that. So I think, to your question, in a legal space, drones or uncrewed systems, they do two main things that I think make them very different from and worth focusing on versus the conventional platforms. The first is they enable a distancing and a remoteness in a way that conventional platforms do not. What that remoteness, what that distance has done with us also psychologically, it's had an effect of giving sort of oxygen to a very effective political messaging that this is a way to fight a risk-free or a clean or very precise way of warfare. And I understand that there is the potentiality. Unfortunately, the reality has not borne this out. So the idea is that maybe the promises are there. The same to be said for newer technologies, that the AI will make warfighting even more precise and even better. The realities on the ground is that that's not how these technologies are being deployed. And as we're seeing, so I just want to first dispel that myth again about this idea of risk-free warfare. War will never be clean and war will never be risk-free. Some physical risks can be mitigated, certainly, or reduced from a military operator's perspective. Physical risks, you're not on a battlefield, you're far away from danger in that sense. But it doesn't mean that all risks have disappeared. The risks have shifted. And I think drone warfare, remote warfare in all its forms is an exercise in risk shifting. And those risks shift not only to the civilians under these particular systems where they're being deployed, but also they create new risks. They create risks for operators that weren't there with conventional platforms. The idea that you're sitting in a space and watching day in, day out, week in and week out, a particular individual who might be marked for targeting, that's a very intimate portrait of that person's life. And those introduce psychological issues that have started to become much more empirically studied and reported on. So again, it's not a risk-free warfare for the civilians, nor is it risk-free for those operating, so the military operators. With armed conflict increasingly fought in urban and more densely populated areas, this has spelled disaster for civilians, this sort of increase in this way of fighting war. This links to the second point I want to raise here, making them differ from conventional platforms. And this is something I think that was mentioned in the second webinar, but I want to highlight it again about the lowering of the threshold to use force. This mythology behind precision warfare, risk-free warfare, makes it more palatable, more tenable to say, okay, well, then I guess it's okay, politically speaking, for us to fight if our troops are not in harm's way. And I think this is a really harmful framework because it then produces some sort of a hierarchy about the value of civilian life for us versus them, the othering inherent to this, and we know a lot from the moral warfare discussion, ethical frameworks and dimensions. The othering, the dehumanization is what this is what produces huge amounts of destruction and casualties. And this is exactly precisely what the international legal frameworks were designed to avoid. And I think that goes back to your point that Chantal that mentioned, respecting the current existing frameworks. And also, Rachel, you highlighted some of the ideas behind why we do this. What's the point of doing this, right? And this is from an international law perspective, a very easy answer. We have treaties and we sign up to them, states sign up to them and develop them, and they're robust and they've existed for 75, 80 years post Second World War. They were designed, literally, the preamble to the UN Charter highlights, these are designed to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The Geneva Conventions were designed with the object and purpose to minimize suffering on the battlefield and protect those who are uninvolved, so civilians. So that's the heart of why these frameworks exist. But that is something we are losing sight of, and that is the cause for a lot of sleepless nights on my end for how do we start meaningfully engaging with stakeholders on this and putting some actual meaningful regulation, interpretation of regulations that we already have. How do we do that? And my short answer to that is that we've got to recenter the protection of civilians, and civilian harm mitigation needs to be at the heart of drone warfare, remote warfare, and any sort of military AI that we are developing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for such a helpful answer and bringing really that kind of civilian protection and international law aspect into the discussion. And indeed, I agree with the point on the silos. I mean, perhaps they were useful at first to try and make things kind of easy to digest and look at, but now they're becoming more of a barrier than of a help. So looking past these, definitely. And I also see linkages on the transparency point that was mentioned earlier. And indeed, the kind of Even though I'm separating the conversation between production and acquisition, indeed, that also relates to use and proliferation. And Chantal, turning to you, so we've talked about different aspects, but of course, the types of uses and the users of UASs in situations of armed conflict vary greatly. That was something that was covered at length in the second webinar. As does the range of systems available, which was something that was covered in the first webinar. So how can policymakers best manage this wide spectrum and prevent proliferation and misuse?
Thanks. A really interesting question. Many things again that maybe to surf a bit on one of Jessica's comments about keeping in mind a comprehensive understanding about the technology, the use of technology, to avoid also what Jessica and Rachel mentioned, the silos between the different way to the different control regime like them. I think here the same apply. If we look indeed the proliferation of drones, the different use of drones, the misuse, it's important here, I think, to really keep this broad focus, because again, I come back to my core expertise, more the civil use of drones in the context of Europe, European Union, and it's the same a bit the phenomenon, despite we speak about different maybe type of course application and technologies, but the rapid technological advance, the developments, the innovation in this booming sector are for, if we to answer the question, take the policymaker point of view, are best to manage this wide spectrum. I think, as Rachel mentioned as well, there's technology change so quickly that the regulator, the policymaker, unfortunately are a bit lagging behind, because they look at the development and then, oh, this new application, and this is true for the civil sector, the civil drones and the military drones. And the worst thing here is what we have seen again in the war in Ukraine, is to use commercial drones, civil drones, hobbyist drones, transform, weaponize, and use on the battlefield, which I think confirm this idea to have a comprehensive view, because technology, as I said, with this rapid development, we are seeing also this miniaturizing and swarming drones, smaller drones, which get also which open new challenges. And so I think here this idea to have this broader approach, and to introduce the webinars, you remind us the different link, different joint initiative. And on this, I think it's interesting to see that you provide and you highlight the existence, the joint declaration for armed drones, but also joint declaration for counter-terrorism. And I think we can benefit quite a lot to enlarge the debate and look what have been said and done, also to consider drones might be used by the terrorists, and what is then discussed for this perspective, which I find interesting in the joint, one of the joint, most of them come back to the fact that member states should strengthen cooperation and exchange good practices. But mainly what I want to highlight here, to speak with the broader audience. I mean, if we keep separate the different debate, we are losing maybe something. And I think it's important to highlight also the need to indeed speak with the civil society, the public and the private actors, the representative from the industry, because we see that the border between the civil and the military use of drone is somehow blurring, is getting not anymore that clear. And I think it could be quite a good avenue to explore, to go more in this comprehensive approach. And is what we have seen again in the context of the European Union. At the beginning, we were looking just civil drones, but we realized it can be misused. So the latest initiative was more in a comprehensive approach, and to consider that misuse can be use of commercial drones, and of course we have the misuse of on drones, but that is here my remark to keep and to consider that the spectrum is getting in this dual use. At the end of the day, it was always dual use technology, first developed and used by military, then this booming civil use of drones, but at the end of the day it remain a dual use technology with this potential to consider and a comprehensive approach. That would be my main remark here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chantal. And indeed, it seems like the issue of siloing the issue is reappearing time and time again. So clearly a strong message emerging here. And Jessica, turning back to you. So after everything that we've heard, and based on your own expertise as well, would you say that our current international norms and standards sufficient to ensure appropriate levels of oversight and accountability of the use of uncrewed aerial systems? And if not, what improvements would you suggest?
Yeah, thanks. I think in principle, yes. Okay, I want to stop right there, because then there's a caveat, a very big footnote at the bottom of that, because that word principle is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because of the way that states have been interpreting their obligation under various legal frameworks, governance frameworks, etc. So we're witnessing a wide chasm between the rules and the reality. Right? And I think, again, not a proponent of a new treaty necessarily on armed drones or any other technologies, but I do think, echoing what I said earlier, we've got to recommit to what's already there. So really looking at the basics of IHL, human rights law, understanding why we signed up to these in the first place, recalling the horrors that led us to get to this place where we started seeing much more of a development of humanization within conflict and within international legal order. And the idea of humanization, I think, is also taken on its own new meaning, of course, with respect to the rapid development of AI-enabled technologies. Like, what is the place of human? A lot of these are existential questions to which I don't have philosophical or other good answers, but I do think that those questions, we need to take the time to really sort it out, and it will take time, even though the technology is proliferating and developing so rapidly, or has the propensity to do so. Certainly large language models, we're all hearing about the fastest kinds of developments. Sometimes it's okay to just take a breath and slow down and sort out, what does all of this mean in terms of how we are fighting wars? What does it mean? Big questions like, what does it even mean to be human in fighting a war, right? Do we foresee a future where it's desirable to have armies of robots fighting other armies of robots? And is that even war? I mean, those are really basic questions, but also quite existential. So I think the way forward is to take what we already have and breathe new life into it. So I think by doing so, that's like a recommitment ceremony or something to why we signed up to it. And I feel like that would make it quite like a nice party atmosphere. Recommit to what we've already signed up for. But in all seriousness, this means a reinterpretation that centers civilian harm mitigation. Concretely, it means more meaningful transparency. Thankfully, Rachel and Chantal also highlighted that in a different way, but also explaining to states and actors in this space why transparency is important, how it leads to meaningful accountability, and why that's also important, and thinking about these terms broadly, not just legal accountability. States often in my engagements with them are concerned that, well, you want more accountability so you can come after us and sue us and take us to court. I can't speak for everybody in civil society or academia, but we're not after trying to sue people into submission. That is a last resort. This is something that accountability can be done at much earlier stages and should be done at much earlier stages, not just because of the civilian harm mitigation implications I've already highlighted, but also because meaningful accountability leads to the legitimacy of military operations, right? And that's not just an academic perspective or empirical research done from universities. this is coming from powerful individuals in very powerful militaries around the world. And in fact, one of those quotes is, "Not protecting civilians is risking strategic defeat." So that is coming from a military background. So it's in the interest of military operators as well to be more transparent and more accountable so that they can improve their processes and center their own, the legal obligations exist. They are robust if we make them robust, right? That's the other side of the legal framework, is that the rules on paper are one thing, it's how states are putting them to practice, right? And the last thing I want to say on this is that the head of legal at the ICRC, Cordula Droga, has recently penned an incredible piece on just security. It's a blog that you can have a look at, and also it has a podcast, both of which I highly recommend. She outlines many of these same pleas, I think. Her brilliant closing line about warning what will happen if we don't take this reapproach to sort of recommitting to these principles that underlie the legal frameworks that exist is that we risk winning the battle, but then we will all be losing the war. And I think that that really resonates with me, because that's really what's at stake with drone systems, and as they increasingly are enabled with new technologies now and in the future. We have to recommit to the principles that got us here in the first place.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Indeed, kind of this willingness, this aspect of like kind of being willing to do so is really important, and kind of recommitting, as you say. I find that really fascinating as an approach, and maybe this is a good turning point before we go to the Q&A, which I see there's questions accumulating, but maybe very briefly in 60 seconds each, before we turn to Q&A, sorry for the time constraints, but what would you recommend after everything that's been said? Or is there one or several specific actions that you would recommend that the multi-stakeholder community should undertake to address the various threats that we've that exist and are posed by the proliferation and misuse of uncrewed aerial systems? So maybe I suggest we go in order of Rachel, Chantal, and finish with Jessica.
I mean, there's a lot of things I would suggest, but I know we don't have a lot of time. I mean, I think we have to make this as brief as possible. We have to really, even if we fully implemented everything that exists already, we would still be talking about the gaps or the recommitment that is necessary. I'm going to steal that, the recommitment. There are differing standards that are out there. There are different purposes, objectives that are out there that are confusing for states, for exporters, for importers, over which rules apply and which rules don't apply. So I think the first thing I would say that we need to do is sort of develop an inventory of best practices and lessons learned with regards to mechanisms that are solely focused on uncrewed systems, but also those that cover other systems. What are good practices that we've learned there? What are gaps or ways to address gaps and challenges in those instruments? How do those apply to uncrewed systems so that we've sort of done this always in sort of an ad hoc way where we're looking at this because everything's so siloed. I think that's the theme of this conversation. Because everything's so siloed, we've looked at things through very narrow lenses, and we haven't had this holistic look that Chantal mentioned in order to really identify what is needed. And we have to ask ourselves, is it really that we need more? I don't know if that's the answer. I mean, I would probably say yes, but do we need more? Or is it that we need to better clarify, better strengthen what already exists? So we need to think about, what are the characteristics that we're particularly interested in better regulating? Is it the systems itself? It's the way that they're used. And say there's one question about, are you talking about having something on export controls, or is it on use? I think it's really a combination, right? We should always, when you're making transfer control systems, you should always be considering how those will be used. What is the context for their use? What are the risks of their use? What are the long-term results of that use? What are the risks of diversion after they are used? So I think it's a more holistic picture. And I think it's also thinking about, we've talked a lot about conflict and civilian harm and military use, but we also have this element of commercial production and commercial use in conflict areas. So again, thinking about what is the scope that we are considering at the moment and how to best address the concerns that we have that we would want to better regulate those systems. How do you do that again in this very holistic way, and how to make sure that whatever regulations are developed, how those regulations, how those controls, how those measures are sustainable over time, I think is also really important, so that we're not just constantly trying to regulate technologies as they're being innovated, but to really look at the capabilities, the end use, the risks that we're interested in controlling or regulating, and then come up with strategies around that. So I don't think I gave you the specifics, but sort of that's the frame that I'm thinking about when I think about what do we need to do and what should discussions in the future hold.
Thank you. Over to you, Chantal.
Thanks. I will continue on that. I fully agree with Rachel, and I think, of course, this needs to be done. Now the question is, are the best way for the multi-stakeholder community to push this discussion? And I will repeat what I said for the different question I answer. I think it's really important at this stage to border the discussion, to speak. And I think already this webinar of UNITER is already a great initiative to engage with academia, with the public, the private actors, from the different, I think to go in the direction that Rachel highlighted clearly is to bring different perspective, because sometimes we hear a kind of vision of a lot of focus on the threats, on the misuse, but maybe there's other ways to also address the challenges, the issues at stake. And I think to bring more people around the table, we often thought our defense sector, again, as I said from the beginning, is the national prerogative, is it doesn't seem intuitive to include the broader audience, but maybe because we speak about the dual use technologies, because many things have changed, the technology is evolving quickly also in the civilian sector, and then pass to the military use. I think that will be to speak about specific action will be also to change maybe the traditional approach to narrow the actors we address, but to include in a more comprehensive way and include different actors. And of course, to strengthen the international cooperation, which sounds always naive, but to come back to what we said at the beginning, there are different regimes in place. Why so many actors haven't come back on their signature, change their approach, or never have been signatories. So I think we should, as well as Jessica said, there were all the philosophy behind this treaty. So it's also a time to reflect about this reluctance. And of course, we should not be naive. It's a special sector which raises many concerns. So, but I think to finalize, to come back to my point, maybe to increase the audience might bring some innovative way of thinking, because we again go a bit outside the traditional way to address stress, to address the use, and I think that could be beneficial for the discussion.
Thank you. And Jessica, please.
Okay, 60 seconds. Always a challenge to be concise as a lawyer. Okay, but I have 3 points that I think would be very quite specific, and it's about, I don't want to make more silos, but it is about addressing dialogue at the international, at the regional, and the domestic level. So the international, of course, I very much applaud Portugal for bringing this back higher up the agenda, leading with a few other countries to to continue to see this as a priority issue, because it does feed into so many other issues with the development of new technologies and armed conflict. In calling for more transparency, oversight, and accountability at that international level or any other level, it's very important that we get quite concrete about what that means. Those are very big terms. They're interdisciplinary terms. They jump across and they mean different things to different people. So work I'm trying to do is to be very concrete about this. And this is something that I worked on at the regional level several years ago. I published a piece for the European Parliament, a report about a model common position on the use of armed drones. So outlining the legal framework, but putting, and pardon the expression for the vegetarians in the room, but more meat on the bones of particular concepts like transparency, accountability, etc., so that we know how to then operationalize them or make them more meaningful and not just very globally abstract. So international focus, the regional focus is very important, but don't forget about the domestic level. That's where a lot of this stuff does become operational. It's the militaries who are making choices about how they employ and what they employ as far as means and methods of warfare are concerned. And over the last 15 years, I've become a bit cynical working in this space. However, recently, there's been some cause for cautious optimism because there has been a turn to civilian harm mitigation as a strategic and moral and/or legal imperative within military actors. So powerful militaries like the United States and the Netherlands, and I just call upon them. They're not the only ones, but those are my two nationalities. So I'm very keyed into those processes. Understanding that from a military perspective, minimizing harm that you do to civilians and civilian objects help you reach your strategic and operational goals better. So I think understanding and having conversations on that level, at the domestic level, it's really important to show the value of reinterpreting, recommitting to these things, not just because the lawyers want you to, but also because it's the right thing to do for the civilians on the ground as well as your own militaries. And the last thing I'll say, at every one of those levels, it has to include meaningful engagement with civil society partners, because the expertise that exists in those spaces, the academic as well as NGO world, as well as industry, this is the importance of multi-stakeholder engagement, because we learn from one another. It's helpful to sit down at the same table and understand that there is a shared goal here. We might not all look at it the same way, but it's important that that mutual respect is there from the beginning, during the engagement, throughout the entire process. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all three of you for answering all the questions I put to you. I know that it wasn't easy and we could talk for much longer. However, I would like to go to the Q&A, seeing as we are we've got another 20 or so minutes, but nonetheless, we don't have all that much time. And we have quite a few questions which are accumulating in the chat. So I'll try to group some of these together by theme. I'll try to get through all of them. I can't promise I'll be able to. So to start off with, there are a few questions to do with talking about conventional weapons. So there's one question with regards to some of which I think have been answered, but if there's anything that you would like to add with respect to any of these questions. So one of them talks about comparison with other conventional systems and how does that work in terms of the reporting categories, specifically with regards to the Arms Trade Treaty, so aspects which are different with regards to uncrewed aerial systems versus conventional systems, and therefore what should regulation focus on. There's another question with regards to different conventional arms frameworks. So again, referencing the ATT, the International Tracing Instrument, the UN Program of Actions, and the Firearms Protocol, whether these address the development, transfer, and use of uncrewed aerial systems. And there's another question/comment which referred to IEDs and they're talking that in that field there are different lenses. I think coming back to your point, Jessica, about that are applied when discussing IEDs, so criminal justice, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and whether we need to see international efforts to counter and effectively control drones more broadly beyond warfighting. So maybe these three to start with, which seem to have a common theme. I don't know who wants to jump in. I don't want to put the pressure on anyone, but if any of you want to take a first stab. Any takers with any of these?
We're all too polite, letting the others. I mean, I can take on the ATT question. I mean, states can report on whatever they choose to report on and whatever their national control list covers. So certainly, you know, we would encourage and welcome states to report on transfers related to their uncrewed systems, either exports or imports. I think that's an important data point. But certainly, what we're looking for, you know, information that allows us to be more thoughtful in our transfer decisions. We're looking for information that allows us to provide greater pictures of what the trade in these systems looks like. You know, where are sort of the destinations, how are they being used? So I think there are complementary ways in which you can provide that information in various reporting mechanisms, whether you're talking about how you're using the systems or where you're using the systems, what risk mitigation measures you're undertaking. There are all sorts of ways in which you can be more transparent in your description and discussion. It's not a punitive, you know, you're not asking states to report so that they can face criticism or punitive measures, but really to provide for that more holistic picture to better understand the ways in which these systems are being used, where they are being used, and the efforts that are taken to better regulate their control or regulate their export and use.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We have a next set of questions, unless, of course, Jessica and Chantal want to jump in on this one. But we do have a next set of questions, which are more kind of focused on the use and the ethics around the use and kind of, I guess, the concepts of warfare. So one of them, I suppose it's more of a comment, but it's talking about, you know, the issue of risk and, you know, the removal of soldiers from the battlefield is actually you know, responsible or morally justified, and kind of how does that work with the use of uncrewed systems. Then we have one on FPVs, which notes that you know, that it can be used for legal force, and alternatives might actually be worse. Or it also mentions that the use of drones from a legal perspective could be you know, justifiable and indeed the better option. And this is indeed something that was discussed in the second webinar. And the person asks, you know, this conversation is about threats, but should we not also mention the positive side of these technological developments? And I will take my prerogative as moderator to also say that this is something that was discussed at length in the second webinar. So please, to the person who asked this question, please do also check out the second webinar because we did discuss benefits at length. And another question which can fit under this bucket of questions is the comparison between uncrewed systems versus other systems which kind of increase distance, so missiles and rockets, and why is the debate different when we talk about uncrewed aerial systems versus these weapon types? So I'll open the floor for anyone who wants to take this package of questions. Yes, Jessica.
I'll take a first stab, and I think they're great questions, and they're questions that we've been all wrestling with for quite some time, and they're not easy all the time to answer. There's not a one size fits all. I'm not an ethical specialist. I'm a legal specialist. I don't pretend to understand just war theory to the greatest extent, but understanding the ethics behind removal or distancing. I want to speak to that point specifically because what this distancing does versus like the rockets in the battle. Yes, indeed, we've been distancing ourselves since we, we were, we started out fighting hand-to-hand combat, and there's no requirement under the laws of war that we need to be fighting face-to-face with our opponent. In fact, it does help us for force protection reasons to move farther away from where the danger is, but while still, allowing ourselves to strategically acquire the goals, the operational goals, etc. And drones have been really helpful in doing so. And I want to make sure that I'm very clear about, I understand this discussion, but I think it shouldn't end there, because the risks that are created are wider than just to one's own military forces. And that is inherent in military doctrine and underlines why militaries fight, understanding the ethos behind fighting wars, because what we're seeing this distancing do, whether it's by uncrewed systems or with increasing algorithmic ways of fighting warfare, the distancing is also having a knock-on effect of removing the soldier from the way that she's fighting a war and the responsibility for the hostilities she's conducting. And those, again, are back to those existential questions I think we really need to be wrestling with. Are we okay with that? Where is the human in this discussion? And understanding that, recently here in the Netherlands, we've had some commentary popping up in the media about we have a moral obligation to put drones in the battlefield instead of our soldiers. But what that does is draws a dichotomy. It's either drones or soldiers, or it's either drones or ballistic missiles, or other forms of rockets, etc. And that's not the case. It's not black and white. It's not an either or. What drones and uncrewed systems enable is a way of fighting warfare that we previously haven't seen. And I think that that's the big takeaway, at least from where I'm sitting. And indeed, again, underscoring the point about the potentialities of some of these technologies, absolutely they're there. Also, AI-enabled systems, there are potentialities that's helping us to understand the situational awareness better, about recognizing who might be a civilian, or understanding what we have playing out on a battlefield. That is a potentiality, and I'm glad people are working on that, because that also helps mitigate civilian harm. But the realities that we're seeing with the way that these are being used on battlefields in Gaza, in Ukraine at the moment, is that there's also a dark side, and a way that these kinds of technologies are enabling states to further erode legal protections based on civilian harm mitigation. And that's what worries me. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think I'll only be able to take another cluster of questions. Oh, Chantal, did you want to jump in? Yes.
Yeah, just to complement what Jessica said, I think if we look all regulatory framework, it's always to find the right balance also for the civil use of drones. And the armed drones, we have seen the same, is I think to find this right balance, and Rachel mentioned it already from the beginning, between supporting the potentials and the developments of the technology. To come back on the positive point, which was maybe not so discussed or highlight in our discussion so far, but I think it's always to find this right balance. But again, to take the war in Ukraine, what we have seen, but in Gaza as well, is that the battlefield is now considered like a lab. And we have seen many private actors also taking the opportunity to try and test the technologies and develop them further. So we should also make sure there's still the control about, as Jessica said, that we don't impact, is not becoming against human rights, or there's no violations, that it's still controlling. Because a point that we did not highlight enough today maybe is the increasing role of the private actor also on the battlefield, who develop this technology, who use them and support, of course, at the moment Ukraine, and taking the opportunity to strengthen their the expertise on this technology. So I think is always to find this right balance between the potential of this technology, because indeed, if we again take the war in Ukraine, we have seen the use of drones for the Ukrainian as a way to finally rebalance the power struggles towards Russia as a smaller country with a smaller army, but to be able to react in a way using drones. So I think it's the main challenge, but the positive aspect, of course, is there because we are continuing the research and development, and there's positive side which after can be reused as we often did in the civilian sector. So, but it's to find the right balance because it's all about the risk assessment. At the moment, there is a risk of escalation of losing when we speak about this war lab. I think there's kind of many concern to make sure we consider.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I won't be able to take any more questions from the Q&A because we're out of time. So apologies to those who've asked questions. But if you've put your name, then we'll be able to get back to you potentially. However, before everybody escaped, I want to, I have the distinct pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Jorge Eduardo Ferreira Silva Aranda, Deputy Permanent Representative from the Permanent Mission of Portugal to the United Nations. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for giving us some closing remarks to this webinar. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is all mine, and I have really very little to add to this very rich discussion we have. Actually, these words are just to thank you all for joining us in this third webinar. We had, as already mentioned, 2 previous seminars, one on the terms and classification, second one on the benefits, risks, and trends. And this one we expected to be this forward-looking discussion on gaps and challenges, and also what we can do in order to address those gaps. And I believe that we have succeeded. Let me thank not only the participants, but very especially also our speakers today. There was also mentioned the support that Portugal has been giving to these webinars, and we are honored to do so. This is the last of this series of webinars hosted by Unity and UNODA. We all know how important this issue is, and we all agree that we need to talk more about it. And in this very sustained and holistic approach that was mentioned here by Rachel, for instance, the idea of addressing, of having this discussion also with the view to identifying best practices and lessons learned, as Chantal was saying, also with this multi-stakeholder perspective, involving also academia, public and private sectors. And last but not least, as Jessica was also mentioning, on this multi-level dimension, bringing the international, the regional, and the domestic levels to fruition. Now, we hope, as you know, that our common endeavor, together with 24 of geographically diverse countries, that we hope to continue promote this discussion, also with a view to tabling a draft resolution in the first committee this year, to continue in a more structured way to continue this discussion, which we all agree is needed and is urgent. So with this in mind, we hope that we look forward, obviously, to the conclusions that we can draw from this series of webinars, and we remain, as always, very much interested and available to foster this discussion in the future, also with that specific objective of the draft resolution in regard to countermeasures. We count surely on you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, for your remarks, and also for your support to this endeavor and enabling this discussion. We are reaching the end of our allotted time, so I will have to close the webinar, although I know we could really continue this discussion, but hopefully it will continue offline and in other fora as well. So really many thanks again to our speakers, Chantal, Jessica, and Rachel, for your insightful contributions during today's webinar and for your thought-provoking inputs, and to the actions needed to be considered by the multilateral and multi-stakeholder community to address the gaps identified and strengthen the existing mechanisms with regards to addressing threats posed by uncrewed aerial systems. And thank you as well to our partners from UNODA, and also, of course, to the Permanent Mission of Portugal more broadly for their support to this webinar series. I want to also take this opportunity to thank all the contributors to our previous webinars in this series. And I just want to remind everyone that you can watch or rewatch the recordings that are available on our website, but also the YouTube channel. So in terms of next steps, I want to let you know that we will be producing a short written output summarizing the key points emerging across the series. This should come out before October. So if you do not have the time to watch or rewatch previous episodes or previous webinars, do look out for this output, which will be shared online. And before you leave us, please also let me ask you to take 30 seconds out of your day to complete an online feedback survey. After the conclusion of this event, you can see the link here and in the chat. This will be very short and is very useful, so we can continue improving the events that we provide. With that, thank you so much for joining us today and throughout the series, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.